before we get into the business of that, we are getting into the other football business. Are you, at this point of the year, as we get into the league, myself and Owen have just been discussing what a fantastic competition it is. Any regrets about not being involved?
Oh, a world of regrets. I'd love to be involved. It's just not feasible. So, but I all I can do is really, really wish Offaly the very best of luck.
You'll go to games, I presume, will you?
I will, yeah. I'll go to Westmeath. I would not miss. I live the width of this counter away from the Westmeath border. Right. I would not miss Offaly Westmeath in anything.
The big derby.
Well, it is for us, yeah.
Who's going to win it? I suppose Westmeath having sort of the silverware in the back pocket now, Paul, obviously, and having unseated the Dubs last weekend.
Well, yeah, and Jack Cooney, you know, he did a very good job training road. He's a very smart man, very nice man, and Westmeath have. And they have had the Indian sign over Offaly for the last while, but I would be a big believer in the qualities and the abilities of Offaly footballers, and I think Offaly have a lot of ability in that team, and the question is getting it out, and we don't know. We haven't seen enough of them to know who's going to take the field and how they're going itself. But Offaly Westmeath, I know it's an absolute cliche, but when Offaly were winning All Irelands in 81 and 82, they struggled to beat Westmeath. And its form is one of those, another cliche, form is irrelevant going into a match like this.
Yeah. All right, we wanted to talk to you obviously a bit about ticket pricing. You have a good piece in the Examiner this morning as well, if people want to check that out. But it's been one of the major talking points of the week. So for people who have somehow managed to sort of miss out on all of this, prices have gone up €5 on league games for qualifiers and for the All-Ireland semis, and €10 then on the All-Ireland ticket. You described this morning these reasons that I'm about to list as profoundly irritating, so bear with me for a second, but this is kind of the case for it, I suppose. Summarising some of them, no major increase since 2011, price is still relatively low compared to a lot of other sports, the money's going back into the game, inflation, and in parts of the country we're not in an awful place economically as we might once have been over the last few years. These are the reasons that are put out there to support that.
Yes, and utterly unconvincing and inaccurate in certain respects. First of all, although there have been claims that there has been no price increase, and that was said by, for example, the GAA president, John Horan, no price increase since 2011, that's just not true. Now, the GAA press release came out and said there was no major review of ticket prices since 2011. Now that is the ultimate in spin. It's utterly disingenuous, and it leads you to believe that there were no price increases since then, but there have been a series of price increases since 2011, notably, for example, in 2017, so memories cannot be that short, of a £5 being put on tickets for All-Ireland quarterfinals, semi-finals. So the notion that there's been no price increases from 2011, we can just dispatch that straight away. And either the spin put out by the GAA's communications office, either it convinced the president of the GAA, or he's part of that spin, or whatever reason. It would be very interesting to know exactly where that statement came from. And it has had an effect, because it has been picked up by other commentators that there have been no price increases since 2011. For example, on your show earlier in the week, Dick Clerkin said it. And it's just wrong.
The league prices may not have been touched in that. Is that accurate?
No, they went up too.
Did they, yeah?
So the online prices went up to 13 to €12, and then have subsequently now gone to 15. Now there has been a bit of movement around league prices up and down over the last number of years, but there have been price increases, and the reasons why the prices were kept low in the first place were economic, and then suddenly they're vaulted back up. And again, we come down to the basic point here. The ticket prices for an All-Ireland football final are now, an All-Ireland hurling final, are now 30% higher than they were at the height of the madness of the Celtic Tiger. 30% higher. Now, is anybody seriously arguing that the economy, or that there is a boom and that there is disposable income that the way there was there? That's the first point. The second point, the league prices for Division 1 and Division 2 matches are at least 33% higher than they were during the Celtic Tiger years, and actually slightly more, up to 50% if you, depending on what way you read it. So is anybody, again, I ask the question again, is anybody seriously arguing that there is disposable income that there was before? It is also argued by the GAA, and this is again a line that where it says from the hierarchy, which it says the economy is strong. Well, really, is that right? It may be very strong in very particular areas of the of this city, and there may be patchy economic development around the country. But anybody who has any insight into what happens across rural Ireland, and there is no excuse for the GAA not having this insight, must understand the partial and limited recovery in the economy and how much difficulty so many families still operate under. The legacy of debt from the Celtic Tiger remains in place. The fact remains that wages have not significantly increased or not increased at all, or are significantly lower than they were during the Celtic Tiger. And that's a fact. While at the same time, in recent years, there has been inflation in the cost of living. So disposable income has been squeezed all across Ireland. And that fact has to be taken into account. To argue blithely that the economy is strong just doesn't do it.
It's also like the economy being strong is also not necessarily a reason to up the ticket price. What are we seeing in terms of the rationale for it, in terms of their explanation of why this money is required, and I suppose the evidence of that extra money obviously being pumped back, I presume, into the game at a club level?
And this is really interesting as well. If we look first of all at the rationale, and I understand, but I don't know if this is the case. I understand that there was a presentation given at Central Council meeting last Saturday. And part of it was, I don't know that this is fact, but I'm told it's fact, that there was a presentation in which the ticket prices at GAA matches were put in comparison with rugby and soccer and other sports. Now, I find that comparison, I find it profoundly irritating. Not in terms of the entertainment that's on offer, not in terms of of anything like that, but how I had understood from the GAA's own words repeatedly over the years that the GAA was not to be compared with these organisations because these were professional sporting bodies and the GAA was an amateur one, and an amateur body that was founded on volunteerism and on that it was community based, that it was sport for all, and that the very thing it wasn't was a professional sporting organisation. So what the only thing we're to be compared on with soccer and rugby is when it comes to ticket prices. Well, how very convenient that argument is.
Tommy Walsh spoke sort of on a similar-ish theme yesterday about how the GAA really is about community rather than about a business. I suppose from the GAA's point of view, they would argue that, particularly the people who are running the organisation, that it has to be run as a business, as a sort of a going concern, that if they weren't doing that we'd be sitting here being very critical of them and saying that they were allowing the thing to go to absolute rack and ruin by, not having things like ticket price reviews or whatever it is. I mean, that argument could be put forward, I suppose.
I understand that. I do understand the argument. I do reject the presentation of the GAA as a business. As again, I regret to bring him out again, but John Horan said it. He equated the GAA with a business and equated the games with products. And I just don't understand that language in connection with everything that the GAA is supposed to be. I absolutely understand that the GAA must make money.
What is it supposed to be? I actually had a look on the GAA website over the last 24 hours in preparation for this, just to see if I could find what the mandate was or what the remit was, because that is the question for me that it boils right down to. I couldn't find anything, by the way, and that might just be due to my poor research, so I'm not going to say that.
There's a brilliant thing to do. It's a very important point, and there's a brilliant thing to do, and it's look at the basic aims and the mission statement of the GAA, which are set out on the official guide, which is available on the GAA's website. It's actually remarkable to read it. It is something that is presented as the purpose of the GAA is presented as being the building and consolidation of a national identity within a 32 county Ireland, with a view towards rejecting foreign games or the games of the stranger, and as they're broadly presented, in favour of native ways. That's broadly speaking what the mission statement says and the basic aims. Now, I would suggest that the great majority of people who are involved in the GAA may have some sort of a soft nationalism, but they do not understand the GAA as an organisation which is given to some sort of building, and the word manhood is used at least once in the middle of it. That's the kind of a central point. Of course, there's more than men involved in the GAA, but this shows how outdated that is. And I think the GAA is a little bit caught between what is it? It tries to be a sport for all, or presents itself as a sport for all organisation. And if you look at the GAA up to under 12 level, there is no institution, no organisation in the country which is as good. The GAA is magnificent at providing games and a suite of games for children all across the country at very little cost, under 12, and it's magnificent at it. But there's a huge disconnect between what happens to make that happen and the manner in which the association is run at elite level. Now, I know it'll be said, well, the ticket prices that are going to be paid for elite sport, for the elite level of the GAA as it's presented. Now, those people are supposedly back involved in their clubs, so it's, again, there's a presentation issue there. But that money is being used, being fed back down to promote what happens at good level. But again, so what? You're charging these people in to watch matches so that you can give them back money to run their clubs. I see it as a pretty spurious argument.
Do you think that mission statement needs to be reviewed and rewritten? And obviously words like manhood and stuff, like when was that written actually, out of interest, do you know?
I'm not actually sure, but it's decades old, and it really needs to be looked at.
What would be the changes that you would make to that?
Sport for all. I see the GAA as a sport for all organisation. The idea that the GAA is, and within that you can have different levels of capacity, and that's the whole point of it. There's no problem with a structure, a pyramid structure, where the very best players end up playing inter-county sport. There's no problem with that at all. It's exactly the way it should be in very many respects. But at its foundation, it is a sport for all organisation, and everything the GAA does, or at least a great swathe of what the GAA does for much of the year, is marketing itself as a community-based organisation. And how can you do that? How can you present yourself like that and then load costs onto those very people when you don't need to? It'd be different if the GAA was under a crush of a mountain of debt. I would understand it then, and we all had to make sacrifices in order to pay off a debt that had been done, or that the GAA was under pressure. But instead, it's going back into a pot, and it just doesn't feel. It's something that the GAA has chosen to do rather than something it needs to do. And I think the gap between those things is the word empathy.
Do you think that's likely to change, though? It does seem that it's been kind of a drip feed, and you mentioned it in your piece over the last couple of years. Like the whole 2011 thing, it just isn't true. Like we're talking about season tickets there at the top, they've gone up. The Ulster Council prices last year were outrageous in some respects.
Yeah.
Granted, it's different from Central Council and all that sort of thing. But it does seem to me that we're being quite hopeful here to think that the trend is going to go anywhere else other than towards the elite.
Change comes to every organisation in ordinarily, not in terms of a big bang moment, but in a series of small decisions which push it in a very particular direction. And that is the story of the GAA in this new millennium. It is a story of an organisation which is heading in a particular way and has no clarity. It hasn't dealt, and it remains a fact that the GAA has not dealt in any meaningful way with the significant issues which face it. It's tipping along as if everything is fine. And on the surface, everything is fine. If you look at Go games from under 12s and the number of people playing it, and if you look at the profile of the association on television and on at elite inter-county level, it is fine. But in the middle, there is a huge problem, and the problem revolves around adult club players and teenagers. The fall-off rate from Gaelic games between the ages of 12 and 21 is 58%. Now, something is going wrong there. So that's the first point. The second point is the decline in the number of teams, adult teams that are being fielded in the country. Now, every single county in Leinster has increased population since 2011. Every single county. And yet, the number of adult teams in Leinster has fallen by just about 150. Now, that tells you there's something going wrong. The only county which hasn't had a decline in adult teams is Westmeath, and that stayed more or less as it is. Even in Dublin, and we all understand the population growth and the economic growth of sections of parts of Dublin, even in Dublin there's been a decline in 20 in the number of teams in a report. These stats are from a report which was conducted by the Leinster Council of the GAA. So now I will say that report is the guts of 18 months old, possibly 2 years old, so the figures may have slightly changed, but the trend is clear. Population growth is not equaling the number of teams, and there's a real question here. The population of the country is predicted by ESRI and by government reports to grow by 1 million in the next 20 years. That means the creation of 500,000 new households. Those 500,000 new households are broadly expected to be in Dublin and in the greater Dublin area, the surrounding counties. How does the GAA intend to deal with that? What is the plan for accommodating that growth? Because at the same time, because there's no land being made available for these teams, the story of clubs all across this city is the story of clubs who are unable to find land to develop their facilities. And at the same time, you go to Laois. Now, Laois is, in many respects, a satellite for Dublin in economic terms now. But there's a report produced by Laois GAA, which suggests that up to 10 clubs in Laois could disappear in the next couple of decades because of want of numbers in rural areas. While at the same time, there needs to be the development of a new club in Portlaoise and how that new club would work. Who's going to do that? Who's going to provide the land? Who's going to finance it? And all of that. Because Portlaoise has now grown to the size that it is. So where is the planning for that? Where is the strategic work being done on that? And so you ask what I think the GAA's mission statement is. I think the GAA's mission statement should be about providing games.
And do you think we're losing those whatever clubs due to the fact that they're going to other sports, due to the fact that there's just less of an interest in team sports in general because of more unstructured work balance, or is there a huge amount of onus that needs to be taken from a GAA point of view?
I think it's a whole load of different things, a whole load of different reasons. Partly it's to do with the changing nature of employment and availability. Partly it is because of a decline in commitment to team sports, which again promotes a question of how the GAA intends to address that and how it intends to look at that and rebuild that. It's also partly to do with where people live and where are they, and the drift towards urban areas, which is now, the gust of 150 years in progress and is not going to be reversed. The drift towards urban areas is absolutely real. And it is true that there are also people who give up between the ages of 12 and 21 because previous to that they were made to play by their parents and they get out as soon as they can, and ideally they take up other sports. But the question is, how many are lost because of the GAA structures and because of the change that happens in games between 12 and 21, where clubs become much more focused on putting their best team out on the field rather than giving everybody games. And in what way does a club accommodate those players who are weaker? And it is not abundantly clear how that happens. That's number one. Number two, it is definitely the case, and I know this from talking to people who have left the game because of this, that they leave Gaelic games because they know if they play, for example, soccer, there is a regular programme of games being played, and they know every single week they will play on a Sunday morning or on a Saturday evening at this time, and it will be week after week after week. And that's clear. Whereas in the GAA, it's throw a load of dates down the stairs and see where they end.
Yeah.
I'm still unclear as to why the rationale behind adding the extra ticket price. We haven't got it, from what I understand, a clear sort of, this is why, outside of the external factors about the economy and that kind of stuff that, as I said earlier, not necessarily in itself a rationale to increase them, why this is actually happening.
A certain amount of money is said to be going back into the club fund for distribution amongst clubs for building of facilities. A certain amount of money is to be given towards the staging of the World Games. But to me, that's not really the question, because this is money that goes back into the GAA's pot, and the GAA makes decisions based on the pot of money available to it. And it can say, well, we're actually going to use this amount of this ticket price increase to give this to clubs and give to the World Games. Well, why don't you take it from the other part of the clubs and stop spending money on certain things? And the GAA, for example, has a broad building programme for stadia around the country, which is not fit for purpose.
In what sense?
Well, look at what has happened in Páirc Uí Chaoimh. Who can possibly explain? We still don't know what the story is in Páirc Uí Chaoimh. Still don't know it. And when is that going to be made clear? Or will it be made clear? And how can it not be clear already? How do you manage to have a gap of 30 million in the spending estimates of two different bodies? This is like 30 million. It's not like you dropped a fiver behind a sofa. Yeah,
John Horn said it would be unlucky if it came to the big fee that the Irish Examiner reported via Peter McKenna a couple of weeks ago. Unlucky was an interesting choice of word.
Well, if this comes down to luck, well, doesn't that tell you everything we need to know? And maybe hold off. Would it be an idea maybe to hold off a little bit on putting ticket prices up until you work out the scale of what's needed in Cork? What's happening, for example, in other counties, finance-wise? What's the story with finances in Galway, for example? And you go on all across the board. And there is a serious question about the management of resources within the GAA. A serious question. And again, finding the answer in loading ticket prices into the ordinary membership is not an answer.
It seems that a resources issue was the last thing we expected in 2019, not from a kind of a historical GAA standpoint, but because of the appointment of Tom Ryan last year. We thought that this would be like, at least, we thought every decision would be much shrewder, coming from a financial background. Like, I know that's simplifying it way too much because you're putting it on the shoulders of one man, and one man can't change the whole course of the GAA. And also, he's only in the job, less than 12 months at this stage. So maybe we need to wait and see. But it did seem that once Tom Ryan came in, we wouldn't actually be having conversations like this.
Well, I felt sorry for John Horan this week on one level. I profoundly disagree with what he said, but at least he came out.
Yeah.
And at least he made his arguments.
It's not necessarily his role either to be getting into the nitty-gritty of finances, is it?
No, and I felt sorry for him on that. But rather than personalise it around Tom Ryan, who I don't know and I'm sure is a very capable fella, I would look broadly at Central Council. This came from a Central Council decision.
Sure.
Now, what happens when Central Council sit around the table? Who says what? Did anyone dissent from this proposal? And if they did dissent, how strongly did they dissent?
And that's not a rhetorical question. That's literally a question that we don't know the answer to.
We don't know the answer to. And so many decisions are now being made at Central Council. I mean, you saw the decision on the rules that were made at Central Council last week, which, in my view, is utterly illogical. So what happens when this group sits around the table and they make a decision? And it would be very interesting to hear the individual delegates who were at Central Council come out, and they're representing their counties and the county boards. It would be, and many of them, and others are from different institutions within the GAA. It would be very interesting to hear them come out one after the next and defend this decision to load costs on the GAA's membership.
Just before we leave it, it did strike me that actually most of this conversation about the ticket prices could have easily been circumnavigated by a more creative solution if they did require more money. In modern sport, we see such amazing advances in the match-going experience. So this is a tax on everybody, no matter who you are. You pointed out the various sort of economic situations at the full array of which exist right around the country. And there are other ways to, I use the word tax very loosely, but to tax people who are going to games, which would be more reflective of your available income. And there's a quick Google will give you any god's amount of solutions as to how you might be able to generate more match day revenue rather than just the very basic, we need to get more.
It's utterly crude. It's a kind of a poll tax approach to
as opposed
raising
to
cash.
We can, as I said, let's not get into the solutions, but there's a million of them if you want to go and check them out.
I come at it, I do agree with that. I do agree with that, but I come at it from a slightly different angle. And what I would be looking at is the broader review of the value for money that the association spends across all of what it tries to do. That must be married to an understanding of what the purpose of the GAA is, what its mission statement is, and what exactly it's trying to do. And that in turn must be married to a plan for the future. What is the strategic future of the GAA and where does it see itself going?
All right, we'll leave it on that note.